Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It is Tuesday, October 23rd, and today I'm going to be doing a video forecast for the full moon. Now, the full moon is coming through tomorrow. It's a big one because of the different planetary configurations that are happening at exactly the same time. So it's definitely a full moon worth paying attention to. In this talk, I'm going to discuss the specific alignments of this full moon. We'll also talk about the signs that are involved, so the different planets that are involved, the different signs that are involved. This full moon will also sort of take us through the end of the month because Venus is going to, Venus retrograde is going through a very critical part of her retrograde phase right now. And through the end of the month, we'll also be moving into an opposition with Uranus. So it's definitely a big moment for Venus as well. So that's kind of going to be camped into this discussion of the full moon. We got through that, and then I will be answering a number of questions that I received in my Q&A series. So just to give you a little preview of that, a couple days ago I started doing videos called, kind of a new video series called Question and Answer, which is exactly what it sounds like. I just take the questions that I receive from my readers or viewers, which I get a lot of, and I've just started putting them into a folder in my email box and basically taking some time to make little videos trying to answer them when I think that the answer might be generally entertaining or interesting for a broader audience. So I'll be going through, I think, 3 or 4 Q&As that are pretty simple, short answers that I have in my box right now after I talk about the full moon forecast. So you can stay tuned for that. We'll be talking a little bit. Let me just give you a preview. So in the Q&A folder, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the 10th house versus the midheaven degree and whole sign houses, void of course moon, as well as a question pertaining to kind of talking with a friend who is skeptical about astrology and how to handle talking to friends that are skeptical about astrology, a few other little things like that. So that'll be coming again after I go through the full moon forecast. So without any further delay, let's talk about this full moon. So let me actually pull up my transit chart so I can just look at it. I always like to look at, it's always helpful if you have an astrological software program to have the live ticker of the astrological clock going. It's helpful for a few reasons. One, it helps you get to know where all of the planets are, and the more that you can know where they are at all times, just sort of memorized in your head, the more you get a feel for their speeds, their movements, things like that. You will become quicker and more intuitive with the way that you work with charts or have an understanding of what's going on the day-to-day. So I really recommend, just getting to know your daily transits. I always like to have them up when I'm talking. I just forgotten to put them up. Now they're up. A couple of things that are important for this full moon. So the sun has just entered Scorpio. Welcome to Scorpio season. I'll be doing a talk on the meaning of the sun in Scorpio separately. I decided not to address that today. Moon's still in Aries, but as soon as the moon just barely pokes into Taurus, it will be a new moon, or a full moon, excuse me. And that's happening tomorrow afternoon. Now, I am taking off for a long weekend trip to see family, so I am doing this video today rather than tomorrow. Typically, I would do it tomorrow, but since I'll be on the road, I'm doing it today. So moon will be full in Taurus, conjoined with Uranus in Taurus. It will be opposite the sun in Scorpio, and the sun is very closely conjoining with Venus retrograde in Scorpio. So overall, that's 4 planets in the mix, right? You have Sun and Venus retrograde in Scorpio opposite Moon and Uranus in Taurus. So wow, that's a lot, right? Here are some important things to keep in mind. So with the theme of the Moon and Uranus together, as well as the opposition from Uranus to the Sun and Venus, there's a lot of questions about what constitutes freedom and spontaneity and a form of self-expression that is more innovative, surprising, something that's different or outside of the status quo. So, for example, in relationships, sometimes you're in a relationship, for a long period of time, and suddenly you start getting this feeling of resentment toward your partner. This feeling comes on and you say, it's been a long time since my partner has surprised me. Or it's been a long time since my partner has been spontaneous. Or it's been a long time since my partner has, just kind of done something thoughtful and out of the blue. And we get really angry in relationships sometimes at our partners for not kind of surprising us and sweeping us off our feet, or, sort of breaking the routine. We often place that expectation or that demand on the other. We say, well, it's their job to sort of surprise me or wake me up to rekindle our romantic connection or something like that. But similarly, in all different kinds of places in the world, we get frustrated when things are repetitive, and when when things keep cycling and repeating in the same old way, we get bored, we get antsy, we get tired. So we often are rearranging things in our lives in order to address that. We all like it, when we're surprised by things. We like a little newness. We like a turn in the plot. We like what's unexpected. Well, this is a good moment, astrologically speaking, to do something that shifts or breaks up the routine. So it's a really good moment to, it could be a really simple thing like at work or, again, in a relationship, to just try to regain that spark that is creative and fresh and organic and new. Uranus in the mix of this says, yeah, let's break some boundaries. Let's shake things up. And Venus retrograde is ready for a change right now as well. Venus in our relationships, Venus where we feel happiness and love, Venus where we feel desire. So there's this theme of like, I need to invent. And so doing that might be a good idea right now. However, going back to the theme of the relationships, and when we're in a relationship and we expect the other person to, we lay the blame or fault on the other person for not satisfying us. This is also a possibility right now that could lead to some troubles. I mean, first of all, it is possible to be neglected in a relationship, or it is possible for things to get old and stagnant, not for any lack of trying to keep them new or interesting and exciting on our part. And fine. This transit could also speak to needing to get out of old things because they're stale and there is no hope for new life. That could very easily be about, a Uranus Venus opposition. Shaking things up is not unexpected for a new moon or a full moon conjoined with Uranus. The need to break apart old structures, to reach some kind of culmination point where you just can't keep doing the same old thing. Fine. That might be it. But there's also this important thing, this important moment in a relationship where we say it's their fault that things aren't new, or we blame it on the externals, we blame it on the circumstances or the environment, and we go fault finding in others or in the environment. And we do that basically as a way of taking away some need to be responsible and some need to participate in the creation of something new ourselves. So be very careful of projecting some kind of resentment or bitterness or tiredness about the status quo onto others or onto the environment, rather than participating in some good spirit of cooperation in the renewal or revival of something new and interesting and fresh. So it's a good time to be participating in the recreation of newness in different areas in our life, rather than blaming or wanting to burn bridges or cut ties, when really we're just as responsible as anyone and everything else for trying to make sure that our lives and our environments stay interesting. Now, that's a kind of like a very basic Venus opposite Uranus kind of symbol, especially when Venus is retrograde in Scorpio and kind of eager to make some changes. There's also a lot sort of in the air right now about commitment and sacrifice and freedom. Taurus is a sign that is often habitual, very grounded, predictable, stable sign. It also loves beauty and harmony and grace. So it's a kind of funny thing because Venus likes togetherness and harmony, right? Taurus is a cold, dry earth sign, and sometimes I think we think of Taurus a lot in terms of Venus, but we don't always catch the earthy part of Taurus. So let me give you a description of a nice Taurian environment. A Taurian environment might be one, for example, in which everything is sort of nicely put together. So it's very beautiful, it's very aesthetic, clean, you know, together. But there may be something that's superficial about it. That could be the shadow side of a Taurus, you know, environment. It's nice, it's stable, it looks together, it looks beautiful, but it's also separative, dry, somewhat rigid. Underneath, there might even be a mood or aura of control around it that's a little intense. So Taurus can be like that. But when you have the full moon in Taurus, right, typically without Uranus, it would be glorification of those qualities, bringing stability, beauty, order, and harmony, kind of earthy, solid, dry, cold, you know, formalizing, but beautifully arranged. And that provides a feeling of stability and beauty at once. But it could be kind of dry, again. So normal full moon in Taurus is exalted there. It's this very comfortable, secure kind of place for changeable moon. And remember, this is the sign in the middle of spring, kind of like the light is returning. So the moon really loves Taurus. However, with Uranus, you know, Uranus's job in Taurus in some ways is to rearrange the house. You know what I mean? To say, okay, it looks nice, it's all put in order, but is there something below the surface that's not quite right? Or is there an aura or mood of control that has created some kind of calcification or rigidity? Is there some kind of stubborn fixation below the surface of what otherwise would appear like a very nice put together situation in our lives? Uranus's job in Taurus, which is now taking place, you know, entered Taurus back in May. It'll be there for the next 7 to 8 years. It's taking a brief interlude back through Aries between November and March, then it'll be back in Taurus. Right now it's in Taurus. Uranus's job in Taurus is to sort of shake up that status quo and to expose deeper stuckness that might exist below the surface. And so there's this full moon in Taurus has the ability to uproot a certain amount of pride, controllingness, vanity, and stubbornness that we have in some area of our life. So when you put that with Venus, the ruler of Taurus, being retrograde in the opposite sign of Scorpio, it's a Mars-ruled sign, there's an intensity at work in this. It says, look, the status quo, however beautiful it is, needs to change. Again, maybe there's something superficial going on here. What's really below the surface? I want the truth, you know? Stability and niceness aren't enough for me. I don't care if it gets a little messy or gets a little raw, as long as it's honest and deep and moving. There's maybe some desire to have, you know, again, a meaningful rearrangement that better reflects a deeper level of emotional connection. So, you know, so thinking about rearranging our lives in a way, or our work in a way, or our relationships in a way that reflects a new set of priorities or a new set of values that two people are having to work out, or that you're working out within yourself right now. That can involve also compromise, right? The cost of compromise, my values versus your values. How does this situation or this setup reflect my desire to control and have it look nice in the way that I want it to versus yours? And some need to have a deeper encounter about value differences and how the environment can be reshaped in order to reflect some level of compromise. That's not easy when Uranus is in the mix, because even though Uranus wants to reshuffle things, typically Uranus is also a very individualistic kind of planet. It reflects the mood of independence and individuating. So something becoming more of what it is, essentially. Now, relationships can individuate, even though it sounds like something that can only be done individually. Relationships also take on a life of their own, and they can individuate. So it's very important to look right now, not so much just solely in terms of the ways in which you might be transforming internally and personally, and needing to rearrange things, and value changes and environment shifts that you need to make, or whatever, but also thinking, how am I a part of a greater whole, and how is that greater whole being asked to evolve, and how can I be a part of that? Very important, because Venus is also about togetherness and harmony. And when you pit Venus and Scorpio against the moon and Uranus and Taurus, there's also like, don't leave me behind here message in this, whoever me is. But there's something about don't leave something out, don't leave something behind. So that theme comes through. Independence versus dependence, strong themes in Scorpio and Taurus. My values versus our values, or our shared values. My resources, in some ways, with Taurus being very dry, cold sign, independent in a sense, compared to Scorpio, which is very much about how to create a deeper kind of bonded cohesion. Those are the water earth qualities at work in this full moon opposition. So questions also about the need for greater sexual, artistic independence or experimentation, the desire to make sudden or provocative aesthetic, style, or appearance changes, a revolution of personal values, tastes, or again, like personal appearances could be something as mundane as a wardrobe or personal decorating or whatever. Also the feeling of being a beautiful misfit. So Venus in her exile, her opposite sign of Scorpio, she's sort of out of her element right now. And opposed to Uranus, the rebel, there's this feeling of sort of the one who's cast out, the one who's rejected. And that's where some of that don't leave me behind, what about me thing comes from. But what about me and don't leave me behind can very easily turn into, if you leave me behind, I'll kill you. You know what I mean? So there's also the outsider and the outsider's vindictive complex. We have to be very careful of that. We can idolize that which we are not, or that which has rejected us, and when we idolize that which we are not, or that which has rejected us, it may come through as anger, hatred, bitterness, rivalry, jealousy, self-loathing. To be very careful that we tend to the parts of us that feel left out. And one of the easiest ways to tend to the part of us that hurts or that feels misunderstood or rejected is to find a way to immediately find our enthusiasm, and we find encouragement in the heart, and we say, okay, how do I put my enthusiasm into action for the sake of loving or serving something other than myself? It's a very quick way to heal. It oftentimes when people share this message, they'll share it in a way that's like, oh, don't be egotistical, go serve someone, right? But that's not really the spirit that we're talking about. We're saying, if you're hurting, if you feel rejected, if you feel left out, generating love and enthusiasm in your heart and directing it toward something that you love, something that you can serve, is an easy way to tend to the thing in you that feels left out, because there is nothing better for our self-esteem than giving love to something outside of ourselves. It just instantly makes us feel good. So it's actually a very practical solution for tending to some feeling of being broken, misunderstood, outcast, like we don't fit in. And frequently, it's a much better solution than trying to manipulate external things to make ourselves feel better. We will unconsciously compete. We will unconsciously get into rivalries and jealousies. We will unconsciously be vindictive or resentful. Those things can come up so quickly when we're feeling hurt, bitter, misunderstood, or outcast, and we try to address that by giving ourselves something, or by doing something for me to make myself feel better. Again, the easy way to put your love and devotion into something could be something as simple as cooking a meal for someone that you love and just putting a lot of love into it, or just sitting down and writing yourself a love letter. You know, it could be just really simple. Just giving yourself some love is okay too, but just being careful of that tendency or desire to, you know, try to manipulate things around to sort of build myself up. Be careful of that right now, because there can be a real selfishness in that kind of mood. On the other hand, you know, it may indeed be a time for some kind of artistic experimentation or aesthetic change, which could be really interesting and fun. Artistic mediums can carry messages right now. Venus is the arts, Uranus is liberation, progress, revolution. And so art, love, sexuality, you know, these things, there can be an aura of like progressive, experimental, revolutionary, etc. The breaking, amending, or radical revision of agreements, friendships, group policies, and partnerships. See, the Venus opposite Uranus during a full moon is also a sign of some kind of radical redoing of something, Venusian, which could be Venus's friendships, agreements, accord, things that have been agreed upon or that are bound together in friendship, loyalty, love, you know, a committed, I say yes to you, you say yes to me type of situation. And Uranus wants to revolutionize that situation. And when it's in an opposition, it's possible that you have to cut or break agreements of some kind. But again, you want to be careful that these things aren't done in the spirit of vindictiveness or like, well, you did something I didn't like, so I'm going to take something back from you. It's very easy for peace treaties to just be shredded right now when they really don't need to be. They maybe need to amend, or they need to be revised, or maybe there's a talk with someone that you need to have. It's heart to heart. I think the symptom, I heard a spiritual teacher say this when I was in India, that the symptom of real openness to the other is the willingness, or at least the openness or availability to being converted by the other. Think about that, to be converted by the other. To be converted by the other in most situations means you're open to being changed by them. And you really have to stay open to actually being changed. It's not like a mental position that you take up saying like, I'll consider your perspective. It's in the heart. We stay truly open to what the other person is and how that could change us. And when we stay open to that, and we just kind of hold that posture real, like open, like I'm willing to be converted to your perspective or to what you're saying here. I'm willing to be changed by you. That willingness is often more important than anything else, because it's that willingness that tends to create willingness in the other. And where there's cooperative willingness on both sides, innovation happens, real innovation that can be harmonious. So think about that right now too. Issues surrounding gender, sexual identity, the rights of marginalized groups of people or individuals, especially surrounding sexual identity. You could see that in the news. It could be a topic of conversation among friends. That's not uncommon for both of the feminine goddesses, sort of the moon and Venus being involved with Uranus, this planet of like liberation. Artwork that inspires change or revolution. You could think about also, this one's a little bit different. Let's go in a little different direction here. The need to challenge the status quo, even when the status quo, by all accounts, seems like it's real together, real nice looking. You know, that Venus in Scorpio says, yeah, it might look nice, might smell nice, might look coherent, and might look or appear together, but I think something's going on below the surface. You know, it's like that. Be careful, because sometimes there is nothing going on beneath the surface, and sometimes that all that reflects is our own paranoia, suspicion, and insecurity. On the other hand, sometimes you will detect that there is some real, you know, there's some real deception happening, or there's not everything is above board. And so challenging something right now, challenging the status quo, even if it's sort of beautiful and nice looking, may be appropriate. You have to know how and when to do that. If you know, my mom used to say, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. It's such a mom thing to say, you know, but I think it's a real challenge for us. How can we be intelligent, kind, and direct in situations where we need to be direct? But kind and intelligent together do work. You know, not everything is as impatient as the sarcastic humor of a sitcom, where we have to come up with snappy responses and one-liners and things that can be easily summarized in a tweet or whatever. We can, if we take our time and are thoughtful and kind and considerate to each other, we can actually talk about a lot. But again, most of it is dependent upon our willingness to be open and possible of being converted by the other. Okay, on the other hand, there are, I wrote, attempts to subvert change or save face through actions that merely appear appropriate. For example, a PR stunt meant to appear sympathetic or meant to save face or avoid financial loss. So when a company gets in trouble for something and they immediately start a committee that's dedicated to diversity training or something like that, and they suddenly seem like, well, that patches it up, right? And you're kind of like, well, it's different than just spending money and looking like you're doing the right thing. It's actually about whether you care to be changed. Again, do I care enough to be changed? Do I care enough for the other to be changed right now? It's a very important question. Do I care enough to let another person in? And the other question that sometimes goes along with this in the other direction is, can I maintain my own integrity, my own sort of space, while allowing someone in? So sometimes you allow people in and you're really just, at the end of the day, you don't agree with them and you're not going to necessarily need or want to change. And this may also be about the attempts that people have to try and get you to change or to manipulate or coerce change, and the need to kind of stay strong in the midst of it and just keep a level head. Discernment is key. The sun in the midst of all of this there's a level of discernment that's there and possible right now as well. So I think that's also very important. You can also think with the moon and Venus both deeply implicated in this full moon moment. You have themes of the goddess and women. So you have women, the goddess, and socially or publicly in the news, you might see themes of disruption, innovation, shock, power, rebellion, feminism. This is perhaps you could think of it as an empowered but also somewhat vulnerable moment for all things feminine. How can it be both at once? Well, because on the one hand, there's something about the goddess that's just really lit up right now and pretty electric and dynamic. However, you also have themes like disruption, shock, challenge, and even Venus retrograde being under the beams of the sun right now, combust the sun, falling into combustion with the sun in a pretty weakened state right now. And opposite Uranus, there's a vulnerability in the air right now too. Now that vulnerability can reflect we're letting our guard down, where your armor has been penetrated, and that might not be a good thing. Like, that could leave you vulnerable. But on the other hand, if we're ever to become closer to the divine in our hearts, if we're ever to move closer to some sense of a reciprocal, beautiful, loving relationship with the divine, then we have to allow our armor, our sense of being alone and doing it all on my own, and I generate my happiness, and it's all up to me to be happy. That is an armor too that has to be pierced if we're to allow for a higher, divinely sourced love to come in and to create reciprocal devotion in our lives. So this is also a moment where vulnerability could be a good thing spiritually or emotionally, could really serve our relationships or our spiritual lives, but could simultaneously indicate moments where you let your guard down and someone tries to take advantage, or someone tries to coerce you to do things or whatever. So it's a vulnerable moment, but a moment that's also ripe for change. So it's an electrical full moon, which means erratic emotionality, brilliant but unstable moods and feelings are sort of in the air. So you think of that, and just, be careful of control freaks right now, your own control freak, other people's control freaks. When we try to control the situation, often enough, there is an underlying insecurity that we have, that unless we control the situation, it will not go well, which is a distrust in a sense, in the universe or God to be directing the play. That we're part of that direction, we play a role, but that ultimately it's also a good thing to trust that there are higher forces and intelligence, and there's a higher order that is also orchestrating things. So this full moon can be about that kind of brilliant and erratic emotional energy that can be a part of the desire to control everything and just get really sort of manic about things, or to possibly feel threatened if we're losing control. But there's also the ability to discover a deeper form of trust, trusting that it's not all up to us. And that's incredibly relieving instantly. To be held, how could we be held, truly be held and release into the arms of the divine if we're not open to relaxing and trusting, right? But that's not a posture that happens just when we go and get a massage or lay in Shavasana posture on a yoga mat. That's a posture that we have to learn how to assume all the time and every day and every hour. And gosh, that's really hard. It's just really, it's really hard to be in a surrendered mood like that and to still walk through the world where you are, in between you and the divine, things might be relaxed and surrendered, but like I don't know if I can trust the neighbor's dog. You know what I'm saying? So it's hard. It's a hard place to walk like. It's hard to walk like that in the world. But this is a moment where there's integration possible so that we can learn to walk that way in the world. We can learn a deeper form of trust and a deeper form of surrender while still not losing any sense of intelligence, discernment, or, just careful or thoughtfulness in the way that we walk in our lives. You also have the idea of the moon as representing the public. The moon is also connected to masses of people, the voters, the city, the community, the group, the family, the tribe. The moon is, in a sense, the collective. The moon is the diversity of the material realm because it is not an original light, but a reflective light. So you, me, my body, your body, the animal, the plants, all of this vegetative life on Earth in the sublunary sphere, the sphere below the moon, is thought of in the sort of esoteric philosophy of ancient Western astrologers as the moon is sort of governor of the material realm, the realm of fortune, the realm of living eternal spirit souls that come into form, where the form reflects and shimmers with the light of eternity, but itself is impermanent and changeable and fluxional. And that's what the moon represents: changeability, flux, reflectiveness. So the moon is the people. The moon is you, me, and all of God's creatures that got a place in the choir. That's all of us. That's the moon. So whenever you're thinking about the moon, a full moon, one of the things that also, the reasons that you have sort of lunacy associated with the full moon is because I worked as a social worker. I worked with schizophrenic adults in Manhattan for several years. And, there was a higher incidence of decompensation for these people that I worked with. And I worked with, again, I've said this before, but I worked with a few people, nurses and people who worked in hospitals and stuff, and they were not into astrology at all. They would kind of joke about it because I was into astrology. They would tease me about it. They would say, well, one thing I can give you is that there's something about full moons because everyone goes nuts in the hospitals under full moons or whatever. And I was like, the police, and one was a former police officer, said the same thing. It's because this is when the city is jamming. You know what I mean? Like the full moon just brings all of the critters out of their shells and we all get out. But the moon is like that. The moon represents the people. So you can also think about seeing Uranian themes expressing themselves very publicly in the middle of this week, especially today, tomorrow, Thursday. There should be some amazing Venusian goddess-related themes and a kind of electrical public quality around them this week. I mean, I would not be surprised to see that, or to see that really pronounced in some way. Let me just give you a simple example that proves exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so these are a few things that show up in the headlines this morning when I checked. Rosie O'Donnell, who is an open lesbian woman in the United States who's I don't know if she's still a talk show host, but she used to be, announces engagement. So again, just right in the news, the goddess, sort of LGBTQ Uranian themes that are more public, as well as announcement of a famous person's wedding, etc. So there's one of them. Right now, where was the other one? Justice Sandra Day O'Connor announces she has been diagnosed with dementia. So there's another one where you have a very famous woman announcing that she is struggling from a destabilization of the mind, right? This is Uranus. So these are things that you can just, again, you can just see them in the news. I mean, all you have to do is just pull up the news and you'll usually see a few things that immediately fit. And we're not even at the peak yet. So I would anticipate more tomorrow, that you will see some more stories really sort of showing up in one way or another. So at any rate, you can think about these kind of erratic themes and qualities sort of in the air right now as well. All right, so let me just go back and make sure I've covered it all. Remember that just because these energies are coming through doesn't mean that we can't sit back and ask the question, what is the message? What is the message? Sometimes rather than being like, oh my gosh, it's Uranus, it's the full moon, and like, I'm just like, I'm going nuts, like this is so intense, or whatever, the ways that we tend to sort of flip out and react. And there's a fun dynamic to that socially. It's like, it's fun to share, especially if you know people who are into astrology. Like it's fun and kind of actually beautiful to share that language with other people and to come together around that language. Nothing against that. But I can't tell you how many emails and messages I get around these full moons from readers, viewers, bless all of your hearts, but paragraphs about how just torn up you are by the energies. And sometimes it happens. Like sometimes you're lit up and that's it. You're like what do they call those pinball machines? You're just going all over the place. But remember that one of the best things you can do if you're being lit up is to just sit down and try to get as quiet as you can and be intentional. If you can be intentional 2, 3, 4 days in a row with a transit and say, what are you here to tell me? How are you here to draw me just a little bit closer to my divine original source, to develop or cultivate that feeling of connection in my heart, to link me up and just bring a little bit more devotion in my life? Which can play itself out in all these different areas. If you ask that question sincerely and keep asking it, being intentional about asking that question and asking for guidance around it, you'd be surprised that it will come. The insight will come. And then that's when we are spiritualizing the transit. The transit moves from some description of material karma that we're bouncing around on like some kind of video game, and it shifts into a portal through which we walk, and our spiritual life is deepened. But it takes intentionality in how we're relating to it. Rather than getting identified with it, we should ask the question, how are these things speaking to me? Become a little bit more of an observer and a reflector, and then the stars start becoming messengers. So that's my message there. The prayer that I wrote for this particular post was, show us the great artwork of your love for us and inspire within us a change of heart. So that's what I've got for you guys today. I'm going to shift over to looking at some question and answers that I've gotten in my folder. If you have question and answers, you can always email them to me at nightlightastrology@gmail.com and put YouTube Q&A in the subject line of the question. So the first question I have is, what are your top 3 to 5 must-have books on traditional astrology or must-haves for beginners of astrology in general? And then also, what book suggestions do you have for learning more about the deeper aspects of yoga beyond asanas? For those of you who don't know, asanas are the physical postures of yoga. So these are 2 really great questions that I'm very happy to answer. I'm going to pull some books off my shelf while we're talking. So for traditional astrology, there's really a number of books that I would recommend. too many probably to recommend. But if you want to learn, you know, sort of old school traditional astrology, and you're interested in that, I talk a lot about it. But Chris's book, Hellenistic Astrology, a great survey. It's big, so you kind of got to be a reader, but very well worth it. I'll put it up there again, Hellenistic Astrology by Chris Brennan. There's another book coming out very shortly that I am so juiced about called Ancient Astrology by Dimitra George. Same, you know, Dimitra was Chris's original teacher of Hellenistic, if I remember correctly, and both of them studied under Robert Schmidt for a long time. So they are, I think, leading lights in the field of Hellenistic astrology. I certainly consider both of them good friends too. This is a book by Joseph Crane that's a nice introductory look at astrology, Hellenistic astrology, called Astrological Roots, the Hellenistic Legacy. Joseph Crane's a really nice guy. I've had a nice reading from him before. So I would look at either of those. This book is called On the Heavenly Spheres, a treatise on traditional astrology by Helena Avalar and Louis Ribeiro. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't agree with every last thing in this text in particular. There's some pretty staunch sort of traditionalist views that I don't necessarily love. But in terms of the overall theoretical organization of the book and covering a lot of concepts, this one's a little bit more medieval era astrology, but it's still in the ballpark of a more traditional approach to astrology. I use this one in my class along with Chris's book and a few others. Those three I would put at the top of my list along with Dimitra George's upcoming book, Ancient Astrology, which you can actually get on her website. So those are some books that I would give you for, you know, basic ancient astrology. If you want a more advanced book that will really just rock your world about astrology, try Jeffrey Cornelius's The Moment of Astrology. That's this book right here. This is a book that suggests that, you know, why do so many different forms of astrology work? And this is basically a book proposing the idea that astrology works more like the way that tarot works. It's more like a form of divination and less like a science where there's only certain ways that things can work. So if you want to read it's a difficult book philosophically on some levels, but boy, will it work you and just make you love astrology if you're willing to do a little bit of work. For people who are interested in outer planets and like sort of cutting edge modern astrology, Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas is one of my favorites. As well as anything by Liz Green if you're into modern or psychological astrology. If you're looking for a good modern introduction to astrology, you're like, you know, I don't know so much about this old school Hellenistic stuff. What is her name? I'm going to forget it now. I'm going to look it up. There is a book by Claire Martin called Mapping the Psyche. Mapping the Psyche volumes 1 and 2. I believe it's Claire Martin. Let me just look that up. Mapping the Psyche. Yeah, Claire Martin. Claire Martin, Mapping the Psyche volumes 1 and 2 is a really nice introduction. She even, I guess there's now a Mapping the Psyche 3. So that's pretty cool. But at any rate, I haven't read the third one. Those are good for beginners. If you want a nice modern textbook that's not as difficult to just sort of introduce you to astrology in general, try Horoscope Symbols by Robert Hand. That's another one that I really like. So those are some for beginners and otherwise, those are some of my favorites. There's lots more. There's too many to name, right? But those are some for the woman who asked the question. The other question that she had was, what book suggestions do you have for learning more about the deeper aspects of yoga beyond asana? Aha, very good question. So for that, I would recommend, again, these are denser reads, but so good and I think very accessible. This is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali with a translation and commentary from Edwin F. Bryant. If you really want to understand the entire sort of philosophy that comes to the sort of Ashtanga yoga path, the 8-limbed yoga path, sort of classical yoga philosophy, this is a great way to go. Edwin Bryant is just a brilliant, he just makes it really easy and accessible. You have to stick with it. It's a long book, but very worth it. If you want to go more deeply into Bhakti Yoga, which is what I study and practice, this is another great book by Edwin Bryant called Bhakti Yoga. And it's all about the Krishna Bhakti tradition. I would also recommend another long one, brilliant, a lot of stories in that one. So he sort of translates classic Bhakti stories about Krishna. I would also really recommend the Bhagavad Gita. just, you know, Eknathaswaran has a really nice translation. It's very acceptable. I like Hridayananda Das Goswami's translation, also very good. Reading the Bhagavad Gita is a wonderful way to deepen your studies of yoga. So those are the three that I would recommend. Check out the Yoga Sutras. You need someone to guide you through the sutras. I wouldn't recommend just reading them on your own because it's a little dense. So even though this book looks long, in my opinion, it's easier to read than just trying to figure out the sutras on your own without the helpful commentary. The Bhagavad Gita, though, is my favorite. I read a chapter every single day. So that's my devotional challenge for the year, adding to my sunrise practice a chapter of the Gita a day. So that answers the question about books. The next question that I had was, let's see. Would you please talk about the void of course moon? I've read that in ancient astrology it had a different meaning when in Jupiter and the moon signs, and depending on the last aspect this moon made to a planet. So what is the void of course moon? I got like 4 questions on the void of course moon. So okay, we need to talk about it. So very basically, the void of course moon is a concept that's often used, especially in horary astrology. It's used elsewhere, and it basically has to do with the idea of the moon having completed all the aspects that it will make to any other planet in the sky, and then having some time left before it leaves the current sign that it is in, where it will make no aspect to any other planet. After it's made its last aspect, let's say like right now, actually, I believe the moon is void of course right now. Let me just check. Yeah, so the moon is now void of course. The moon is void of course in Aries right now, having just made a square to Pluto. So you could think about it like that. So there is no more aspect. The moon will not make an aspect to any planet prior to leaving the sign of Aries. That's a void of course moon. So it's got from 19 Aries all the way to the end of the Aries. There's no more aspects being made, which means the moon is called void of course. So the typical way that this is read is like this. In a horary chart, let's say you're casting the chart, you're asking a question if such and such thing will happen, and the moon is void of course. Typically the typical interpretation is, well, nothing much will come of the matter. The reason that nothing much will come of the matter is because between the moon has made its final aspect and nothing more is going to happen. And the moon is usually thought of as a prognosticator of events. So the moon making no connections to other planets means sort of nothing happens. That's the general idea that people have of a void of course moon. However, that idea is not entirely correct. So void of course moons, whether you're doing electional work or doing horary work or whatever, if you were born with a void of course moon, first of all, I don't think I've ever seen it used to great effect in a natal chart. So it's almost always something that you'll say like, oh, it's a void of course moon today. Electionally, that means you shouldn't go and buy this thing, or you shouldn't go and do this thing because it, you know, might not be a good time to, because nothing's really connecting with the moon. That's like generally the way that people think about it. But there's a problem with this. And this is illustrated by William Lilly. Here's what he says about void of course. A planet is void of course when he is separated from a planet, nor does forthwith during his being in that sign apply to any other. This is most usually in the moon in judgments. Do you carefully observe whether she be void of course, yea or no? You shall seldom see a business go handsomely forward when she is so. Okay, so William Lilly, he's a great practitioner of horary astrology. He wrote a textbook on it called Christian Astrology. But what he writes about it is all manner of matters go hardly on when the moon is void of course. But what he actually means by go hardly on is not that barely anything happens or that hardly anything happens, but rather that there is frustration and there is some level of difficulty, or it's more laborsome. So it's not that nothing can be done under a void of course moon. The general signification for void of course moon is if you're thinking of starting something or doing something and the moon is void of course, you may labor with it a little bit more. It may not go as smoothly. Typical reason for this is that, again, when the moon is making connections to all different kinds of planets, it's as though, you know, things are happening. So when there's a gap in the moon in a sign, the idea is that it's just there's a little bit more, it's a little more rugged or something like that. But it shouldn't be looked at purely in terms of, well, nothing is going to happen. The actual wording that Lilly uses is that all matters go hardly on, which is a way of saying that there is some difficulty. They go on in a difficult manner. He says, except she performs somewhat if void of course, and be either in Taurus, Cancer, Sagittarius, or Pisces. So people always ask, well, so the moon, even if the moon's void of course, but in those signs, it might be a little bit better, but why Taurus, Cancer, Sagittarius, or Pisces? Well, quite simply because Taurus is the exaltation of the moon, Cancer is the domicile of the moon, and Sagittarius and Pisces are the signs of Jupiter. And Jupiter is a benefic. So the connection to the domiciles of the benefics is here. Taurus is the rulership of Venus. Cancer is the exaltation of Jupiter and rulership of the moon. Taurus is also the exaltation of the moon. Sagittarius is the rulership of Jupiter. Pisces is the exaltation of Venus and the rulership of Jupiter. All benefic places. You might ask, well, why is Libra left out? Libra is left out because Libra is part of the Via Combusta, which is the place where the sun is in its fall, stretches into Scorpio, where the moon is in its fall. So these four signs, Taurus, Cancer, Sagittarius, and Pisces, are considered places where the moon will not be made, things will not be made as difficult because these signs are a little bit, they have relationship to the benefics. So that's an answer for you about void of course moons. Someone asked if they can be applied natally, and I said, no, I wouldn't. I really don't ever look at void of course moons in the, I don't look at them in the, in natal charts so much. Second point is that someone asked, wasn't there an older traditional concept that's different from void of course moon, that's but similar? And yes, that's called running in the void. And during the Hellenistic era, the appears that the original concept of the void of course moon, which it may have actually been diluted over time, is this concept of running in the void. Running in the void happens when the moon, for example, will not make an aspect to any other planets within 30 degrees of wherever it is currently situated. So for example, right now it's at like 18, 19 Aries or whatever it was. It would have to not make an aspect to any other planets from 18 or 19 Aries all the way to 18 or 19 Taurus. And that 30-degree chunk where there's no aspects is exceedingly rare. So that's a very rare condition where the moon would thought to have been really debilitated because it's not making any aspects to a planet, not just before the end of the sign boundary, but within the full next 30 degrees. It could go over into the next sign. So that's called running in the void, and it's an older, different concept. It's possible that our more, sort of the more medieval horary concept of a void of course moon is derived from that or related to that, but also it's possible that it was a misunderstanding of that original idea. It's hard to say. Okay, so that's something about the void of course moon. What else? I have just... Someone asks, the question, you reference ancient astrology a lot, so I was wondering if you might be able to pin down how each planetary body, astrological sign was prescribed certain characteristics. Why, for example, does Mercury equal communication of the mind? In other words, how did people first say that planet represents that? The question arose while trying to neutrally explain the significance of astrology to an atheist friend who kept making the what if 6 was 9 argument. Basically, he is saying that it was humans who placed certain characteristics on certain planets, thus invalidating, in his mind, astrology altogether. So I can't address that simply because it would take way too long to try to go through, every planet and sign and sort of try to explain how they were all originally assigned. The truth is that in a lot of cases we don't know. We have explanations that seem very probable or likely, but we do see some universality among traditions in terms of how they thought about the symbolism of the planets, which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of numerological, or I should say mathematical, ideas that are encamped in astrology. Robert Schmidt's done a lot of work on this to show that there was a sort of relentless rationality to the way that the ancient Greek Hellenistic astrologers were conceptualizing the universe, and how astrology was really its own cosmological model, like a mathematical or like a model of reality like a physicist would create or download or receive or something. And in that regard, it's likely that a lot of the meanings of the planets, for example, were based not just on like, well, it looks this way in the sky, or it sort of, it retrogrades a lot or something like that. But rather based on, really intricate philosophical and mathematical combinations that were rooted in the astronomy of the sky and in the geometry of the circle. And it's very complex. I'm definitely not the person that could address that, so intricately to satisfy the mind of a hyper-rationalist, But I do believe that ancient astrologers were sort of hyper-rational. I was just visiting with Robert Schmidt, talking to him about the ancient astrology, and those were his exact words. He said the ancient Greek astrologers were relentlessly rational in their construction of astrology. Astrology wasn't just some kind of divinatory model they were making for them. It was a complete cosmology that they were building through this kind of relentless rationalism. It was mathematical, it was philosophical, it was very deep. So to explain all of that, it is really what the work of Hellenistic astrologers have been doing, trying to figure out what was this cosmology that early astrologers were working with. It seems like it was a unique system in relationship to other systems like Babylonian ideas and Egyptian ideas and so forth, but it also had its own kind of symphonic cohesiveness. So your friend probably wouldn't be satisfied by anything I could say really quickly. You know what I mean? The other thing, the broader question though here to me is when you have someone making this what if 6 was 9 argument, see, they're starting from a premise that's really not going to work for us as astrologers, because they're starting from the premise that human beings place meanings on things that are arbitrary. Right? So astrology arises from a view of reality that's just the opposite. Anything like that's rational to be found in the meanings and patterns of the cosmos depicts a higher intelligence behind it or within it. And so we start with the opposite assumption. We start with the axiomatic truth of the existence of God or the eternal. And we say that matter, just like something intangible that you can't really see or grasp, behind my words right now is sort of intending them out into the world, that reality itself, that matter is actually the kind of end result of the intentionality of consciousness, so that matter forms around consciousness. But really rational and empirical people think that all that exists is matter, and that that meaning is a sort of something that is arbitrarily assigned to interactions of physical laws and properties. Because they believe that as a form of axiomatic truth, that is their faith statement. Our faith statement is really just the opposite. And so there are competing faith statements at work there that aren't easily worked out, because faith is a matter of the heart. And as we who believe that we are all eternal spirit souls and that the material world is a reflection or emanation of something divine or eternal, we say, well, faith comes from the heart, it comes from the soul, and it comes from consciousness. It's a choice. Ultimately, a choice made in the heart is a matter of directing awareness and intention. It's free. It's free. So someone who has a really rational empirical point of view is free to have that view, and that's their axiomatic truth. So that's where they'll stand. It's really difficult to get someone off in that platform through, you can't try to win the argument within their framework. That's the one thing I've really learned, is that you have to communicate rather that there's a fundamental difference in what you're assuming to be true about reality. And once you can get down to that, most of the time you can just agree to disagree. And it's almost fundamentally easier than trying to persuade someone within a hyper-rationalist, sort of strictly empirical paradigm. So, it sort of where you place your faith that is very important in that kind of conversation. And I just tell people, when people get into that with me, sometimes I have family members, extended family or whatever, they're really skeptical about astrology. They'll be like, well, didn't humans just sort of arbitrarily make this up and da 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 da? And I'm like, well, I'll just say, well, I choose to look at, systems of order and meaning in the cosmos as stemming from or expressions of something that's divine and eternal. I see all matter as a reflection of something spiritual. That, I'll just tell them basically where my faith lies, and then I'll say, if a person doesn't have that view, if a person sees that all there is concrete materiality, there is no concrete or, material argument that will likely satisfy them that there is something beyond that. Do you know what I mean? It's like a matter of putting the cart before the horse most of the time. So that's my response to that one. I hope that helps a bit. I believe there was another one on nodal returns and another one on Pluto and a few others that I will get to at a later time because we're at an hour. So thank you all very much for listening. I hope that this was interesting for everybody. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you guys have a very great full moon. Feel free to write me with your stories. And again, if you feel like asking a question for a future Q&A session, just write to me at nightlightastrology@gmail.com and put YouTube Q&A or just Q&A in the subject line, and I'll try to get to it. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.